British writer and critic Jude Cook announced last month that he's starting a small independent press that will publish mainly literary fiction and memoirs by young men. Mr. Cook told The Guardian that literary fiction, this is highbrow stuff, has come to be dominated by women, quote, giving rise to a situation where stories by new male authors are often overlooked with a perception that the male voice is problematic. After that, we reached out to Jude Cook, who told us he'd rather not talk because, quote, the discourse has got slightly out of hand.
So, that was a snippet from Vox's podcast, Today Explained. The May 23rd episode, All the Sad Young Literary Men, explores writer Ross Barkan's claim that young men's voices have vanished from literary fiction. My sister sent me this episode, and after listening, I was immediately curious about what other people thought. The Today Explained subreddit is not super populated, but this episode attracted a lot of attention compared to others. Multiple people pointed out their problems with Ross Barkan's claims and general sentiment, but the whole thing got me wondering, is Barkan right? Are young men, especially young white straight men, being pushed out of publishing? Well, let's start at the beginning and work our way down. I want to take a critical look at the claims in this podcast and really see what weight each claim holds. So, if you'll recall, this whole thing started because Jude Cook decided to start a press that would focus on male writers. According to Noel King on Today Explained, Cook told The Guardian that literary fiction has come to be dominated by women, giving rise to a situation where new male authors are often overlooked, with a perception that the male voice is problematic. Now, if you go to Cook's interview with The Guardian, you'll find he indeed said just that. But is he correct? Well, there is some evidence to suggest that Cook is absolutely right. For example, this tweet from Joyce Carol Oates claiming her literary agent friend told her they can't even get editors to read first novels by young white male authors. And look, I'm not saying Oates is lying here. Why would she do that? But I do think this is highly anecdotal, and reason alone tells us that not all editors can be rejecting first-time novels from young white men on instinct. Then again, we can also turn to Data USA for their statistics on Americans with the occupation of writer and author. The data shows that while there are 72,000 men making a living as a writer or author, there are 102,000 women doing the same. This data comes from 2022, showing a writing workforce that is 58.5% female and 41.5% male. Notably, the data also shows that in terms of ethnicity, 91.9% of writers are non-Hispanic, and by race, 80% of writers are white. But keep in mind, these are not necessarily fiction writers specifically. In fact, the site gives us this breakdown for the types of writers we're dealing with. There are folks who work in advertising or at universities or as civil servants. Only 16.1% of folks making a living from writing are designated as independent artists, writers, and performers, which really could mean any number of things. It's also worth noting that while there might be more women than men making money off of writing, there is still a notable pay gap between the two groups. While men on average make almost $88,000 a year writing, women make about $63,700. Interesting how there can be so many women in this line of work and their average salary still falls short of men's. The Guardian article also cites a 2020 piece from The Times titled Booker Prize 2020 Longlist, Where Are the New Male Hotshot Novelists? The piece's author, James Marriott, writes, the past few years' best-selling literary debuts have all been the work of women. Only 2 of the Observer's 10 best debut novelists of 2020 were men. In 2019, there was 1 man, and in 2018, there were 2. Older male novelists can still command the bestseller charts and prize lists, yet no younger male literary lions have risen to take them on. This is why it's so important that these discussions emphasize young male writers. Like, before writing this video, I reached out to one of my peers, a young Latino writer. Apropos of nothing, I asked her to name as many living authors as she could. I should note that this friend of mine mainly reads classics, but she came up with Brandon Sanderson, George R.R. Martin, Stephanie Myers, J.K. Rowling, Suzanne Collins, Stephen King, James Patterson, Neil Gaiman, Christopher Paolini, Paul Stewart, and Chris Rodell. Can you see certain shared traits between these authors? Well, one of the important shared traits for this discussion is the fact that not one of these people is under 35 years of age. If I ask the question, are men being pushed out of publishing, the answer is a resounding and obvious no. If I asked you to think of an author, living or dead, odds are good you'd think of a white man. But if the question becomes, are young men being pushed out of publishing, well, there, the question perhaps merits more of a discussion. In general, naming a living novelist under 40 is a challenge, whether male or female. The only one I could really think of off the top of my head was Ocean Vuong, but I think most readers would describe him as more of a poet than a novelist, right? Still, he has written novels, so it counts. Okay, but I've deviated a bit. We were talking about whether fiction has become dominated by women. I think dominated is a strong word, but it does seem that women are getting more of a spotlight than men are in fiction publishing these days. So, why? Well, the first guest on Today Explained offers some helpful insights. For one thing, college education. Economist Joel Waldfogel explains that as more and more women enrolled in college, more women participated in the economy in general. Thanks to enrollment in universities, more women than ever could read and write according to publishers' standards. Waldfogel says that 1970 to 2015 is the tipping point, when female authorship jumped from 15% up to 50%. Looking at the National Center for Education Statistics data on degrees and sex of students, it would appear Waldfogel is correct. By 1977, more women were earning associate's degrees than men. By 1981, it was more bachelor's degrees, and by 1986, more master's degrees. And finally, by 2005, women were obtaining more doctorate degrees than men. Going back to our Data USA statistics, we see that women in the writing field are routinely more educated than the men in the same field. Granted, again, keep in mind there are more women in the field overall. Still, these numbers are telling. Now, follow my logic on this one. Which type of person is more likely to be reading novels? Someone who enrolled in and graduated from college, or someone who didn't? And I'll reiterate, I'm not making that supposition based on any data, but I do think logically, college-educated folks are more likely to read fiction. And the data shows that more and more women are college-educated while fewer and fewer men are. And while college education certainly is an important economic factor here, there's something else to consider. The cruel truth of the matter is that publishing isn't about elevating voices. Publishing is about making money. If the publishing industry stands to make more money from female writers and readers, then the publishing industry is going to act accordingly. Some statistics show that up to 80% of fiction readers are women, which is honestly kind of mind-blowing. If that's the case, is it any wonder that publishers want to prop up more female authors to try and click with the potential female reader base? And this is, sadly, why non-white voices aren't more present in publishing. Even though there are many diverse audiences reading fiction, the publishing industry simply doesn't see those demographics making money. When it becomes profitable to elevate those voices, the publishing industry will do so. But for now, as long as white women are making money, publishers will ride that gravy train all the way to the bank. Going back to that article from the Times, Marriott explains, John Ash, a smart young literary agent, says that publishers are keenly aware of who is buying novels. When sales and marketing teams and publishing houses look at a young literary fiction debut, they have a certain comparison to go to. For example, Sally Rooney or Nisha Dolan's debut, Exciting Times, which has done very well recently. If you get it right, you hit this readership of young women who pick up books in a way that young men don't. If you make something the fiction debut of the summer, you can shift so many copies. There's just not that confidence there with young men. Another thing Waldfogel points out is that more women than ever are publishing these days, in large part due to self-publishing. The barrier to entry is lesser in writing and publishing than in other fields thanks to outlets like Amazon. There's a really interesting NPR article about how women came to stake such a prominent claim in publishing but haven't really done so in other creative fields or other historically male-dominated fields at large. In fact, funnily enough, that NPR article cites Joel Waldfogel, the first guest on the Today Explained podcast. This article again credits the supply and demand of it all, the fact that women are driving a lot of the publication industry as consumers, but there may be more to it than that. The article points to many social factors that would help women succeed in publishing as opposed to other industries. For example, the Harvard economist Claudia Golden has published influential research that suggests one central culprit behind gender inequality in the labor market: the reality that women continue to bear the overwhelming burden of caregiving responsibilities in many couples. But writing is mostly a solitary endeavor. There's a lot of flexibility involved as compared to other careers. The article also points out that writing, especially fiction writing, is quite a low-paying field. It wouldn't make much sense for men, society's primary breadwinners, to pursue fiction writing as their ideal full-time job. Greg Rosalsky, the NPR article's author, also points out the following after speaking with Waldfogel and author Jesse Gaynor. Quote, "Maybe the fact that book writing is done mostly alone means there is less discrimination and fewer female disadvantaging biases and social dynamics in the industry. Industries like movie production and scientific and technological inventing are dominated by gigantic corporate bureaucracies which are intensely hierarchical. They also are more capital intensive. Maybe that opens the door to more sexism and a resistance to investing in historically underrepresented creators like women. However, as I've already pointed out, publishing is also hugely capital driven. Right now, it's profitable to publish more books by younger women. That might not always be the case. Waldfogel also makes the case that more men are publishing, it's just that more women are publishing at higher rates, especially in fiction. So where does that leave the men? Well, the Times article points out that men are writing more nonfiction these days. If men aren't writing as much fiction, women get more fiction out there by default. To quote Marriott again, "The thing that makes most people want to become novelists is reading lots of novels. If few young men are reading fiction, that suggests few young men are also nourishing ambitions to write it." And when asked if men under 35 are being underserved, Waldvogel says it's really hard to say, because there are more books in all categories now than there ever have been before. This data from Lee and Low Books in 2023 shows similar conclusions based on those we've already seen. 71.3% of people who work in publishing are cis women, but another interesting tidbit here is that 30.9% of the publishing workforce is aged 25 to 34, and another 24.5% are 35 to 44 years old. That's a lot of young people, and yes, I know working in publishing is not the same as being an author, but still, to suggest that young people are being pushed out of publishing on the whole, I think that's just wrong. Now, we can't prove anything necessarily, but the data certainly shows that more women are reading and writing fiction in general, while men seem to be gravitating toward nonfiction. The second guest on Today Explained, Ross Barkan, actually made that point.
I also think at the same time, young male writers, white and non-white, were taking less of an interest in fiction. It's a chicken and egg challenge, where is it the publishing industry deciding this is no longer something we're going to push or take a real interest in, or is it, market forces as well?
Even so, Barkan admitted that he felt his identity as a young straight white guy held him back in publishing in the 2010s. During that era, he claimed the literary world at large was less interested in what straight men were publishing. Upon hearing that claim, I decided to do something maybe a little petty. I went to the Wikipedia page for Publishers Weekly list of best-selling novels in the US in the 2010s. Of the 100 books listed here on Wikipedia, 59 were written by men, while 41 were written by women. And yeah, pretty much all of the male authors who sold were established male writers, but the same goes for a lot of the female authors here. Still, to say that publishers weren't interested in male voices during the 2010s feels disingenuous. You know what publishers really weren't interested in during the 2010s? New voices. And Barkan acknowledges this. He explains how hard it was to get his book published, saying it was rejected by a lot of publishers. But at the same time, he acknowledges that so many books are rejected by publishers, not just books by young white men. As he put it, you never know why a book gets rejected. And remember, this is all economics in the end. Why would publishers take a chance on new literary voices when it's the established voices who, time after time, clearly make the most money? If we want to talk about why fewer young men are getting traditionally published, maybe we should first talk about how hard it is to get traditionally published at all. Any young author is going to have a hard time making a name for themselves, even all the young female authors out there. The reason older authors dominate publishing is because they've had years of practice, years of name recognition, and years of hits to bank on. So, are young men being underserved in publishing? Well, like Waldvogel said, it's hard to say. But the fact that there are more books now across all categories is a good thing for everyone, and we'll come back to that in just a second. But before we wrap up, there is one more thing I want to discuss. One point that Barkan harps on a lot is how valuable the straight male voice is in publishing. First, let me just say, I agree. I think all voices should be present in publishing, but I feel like Barkan has kind of a narrow view of what the straight male voice actually is. Listen to these two quotes from the podcast.
I think you have a general lack of the heterosexual male perspective in newer fiction. There's a long history of writers portraying toxic masculinity and rough male characters, and it feels that you see less of that today. Writers should write about whatever sexuality. I don't believe in limiting anyone in that way. But I thought it was a choice, right? Because straight male lust is very disconcerting. It's not easy to write about. What do men think about? The novel isn't really, the modern novel, the current novel, in my view, and this is an argument someone can push back, is not addressing that enough. The nasty, nasty men. The men who are not, maybe they're good at heart, but they have a lot of bad thoughts and they take bad actions. You don't see that much in fiction today, I would argue.
Sorry, it's hard to even know where to begin when addressing these quotes. So is Barkan saying that the young male voice is valuable in literature as a way to understand toxic masculinity or straight male lust? And remember where we started, with Jude Cook and his new press that seeks to address overlooked male narratives, stories that address fatherhood, masculinity, working-class male experiences, sex, relationships, and negotiating the 21st century as a man. I find it funny that we're talking about fiction here because it sounds like what these men want is non-fiction, no? Because if they want stories from men about fatherhood or masculinity or male lust, well, we can find plenty of those stories in the real world. What's more, we could also find plenty of fictional stories about fatherhood, masculinity, and male lust, all written by women. And sure, you might argue that a woman can't accurately portray those things, but I'd disagree. Is Victor Frankenstein not a believable male depiction because he was written by a woman? I think with enough time, care, and research, anyone can capture the experience of another in fiction, but that's a deeper discussion for another day. For more on that, you can watch below the phrase video, Who Can Write Whose Story? I'm not saying fiction is all about escapism. I would never say that. There is so much more to fiction than pure entertainment away from the real world. However, I would say that one of the main reasons I write fiction is to put myself in the shoes of another. It's about empathy and curiosity. What would it be like to live that person's life? As a young straight man, I do have experiences related to masculinity and male lust, and part of me certainly is interested in writing about those topics, but there's so much more I want to write about beyond that. Is my voice in fiction only valuable insofar as I can portray my own experiences? Of course not. That said, I'm sure I've still got a long way to go before I get published. While writing this video, I was reminded of a Ruth Bader Ginsburg quote. She said, "When I'm sometimes asked when will there be enough women on the Supreme Court, and I say, when there are 9, people are shocked. But there'd been 9 men, and nobody's ever raised a question about that." Is it possible that some of the uproar around this discussion simply comes from the fact that men are used to being on top in this world, so when they're not, it feels like something disturbing has happened? At the end of the podcast, Barkan says,
But look, there are winners and losers, right? Women were losing, now men are losing. But I will say there's no solace offered to the 26-year-old male who must pay for the sins of the past, right?
I think framing it as winners and losers is pretty unhelpful, and I don't see it as men of today paying for the sins of men past. No. In an ideal world, the Supreme Court and government at large would be perfectly representative of the population and its interests, and publishing would be the same. Unfortunately, as we've pointed out, there are so many factors, especially economical, that dictate what publishing looks like. The same, coincidentally, goes for government and the Supreme Court. The fact is, men just don't read the way they used to, which is a bummer, and I'm not solely blaming men for that. Again, there are so many factors that contribute to the decline in male readership, many of them economical. But with that in mind, maybe Jude Cook's male-focused press isn't such a bad thing. I think if Cook were approaching it in bad faith and calling men marginalized, underrepresented victims, that would be a different story. But it seems to me Cook only has the best of intentions, that is, to get more men into reading and writing. And one last thing before we go, a quote from the Times that I hope will give all aspiring authors a bit of comfort and encouragement. "Everyone I speak to is quick to point out that publishers remain interested, above all, in good writing." And I hope that's true now and forever, regardless of any external factors. But what do you think? Are men being pushed out of fiction, or is there more to it than that? Can you think of many young authors publishing these days? Please tell me everything. If you liked this video, please let me and the algorithm know. If you like what I do here, please consider subscribing and supporting me on Patreon. It means a lot. I can't thank my patrons enough, including for their help with this video. Subscribe to the second channel if you want, and follow me on my socials. And keep in mind, ultimately, this is a rough draft.